Hi, everybody. So today we'll be talking about the basal ganglia. Now I know looking at the flowcharts can get really confusing, so I thought there would be an easier way to kind of go over this by talking about what's going on before dopamine is introduced to the system. So before dopamine enters the system, in the direct pathway, which I have written over here on the left side, in the direct pathway, the globus pallidus internus, and the substantia nigra reticularis, are working together by releasing GABA at the thalamus. And when GABA is released at the thalamus, GABA, of course, is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It will prevent the thalamus from going up to the motor cortex and saying, hey, we're ready for motion. So that is not happening. So we have no motion as a result. In the indirect pathway, when the indirect pathway is active, there's a couple of things that are happening. The striatum is releasing GABA at the globus pallidus externus. Now, I'm going to put a hold on that. We're going to move ahead a little bit. The substantia nigra reticularis and GPI is being activated by glutamate from the subthalamic nucleus. Now, let me repeat that. The subthalamic nucleus is releasing glutamate to activate the GPI and substantia nigra reticularis. Now, we just said in the direct pathway that the GPI releases GABA to the thalamus, inhibiting it, and it does the same thing in the indirect pathway. The only thing is that it's being activated by the subthalamic nucleus. So I'm just going to recap that. The subthalamic nucleus is releasing glutamate to activate the GPI, which will then in turn release GABA at the thalamus. Okay? Now, let's go back to the striatum in the indirect pathway. It's releasing GABA at the GPE. And we already said GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it is inhibiting the GPE from doing something. Now we're going to show what that something is in just 1 second. So what happens when we want to move? Let's go back to the direct pathway. In the direct pathway, the motor cortex will send a signal to the substantia nigra pars compacta to release dopamine, and specifically D1. D1 for direct. So D1 is released and it's activating the striatum. And the striatum is going to inhibit the globus pallidus internus from releasing GABA. So what's going to happen here is the striatum is going to inhibit the GPI. And if the GPI is inhibited, then it can't release GABA anymore. And if it can't release GABA, then the thalamus is no longer being inhibited. So then the thalamus will go ahead and send the signal to the motor cortex. Now let's talk about the indirect pathway. Remember how I said that the striatum releases GABA at the GPE? So when we release dopamine, now this one is going to be D2 for indirect. This is going to have a negative effect on the striatum. It's going to downregulate its ability to release GABA. So it's no longer going to be able to inhibit the GPE from doing something very special. The GPE releases GABA. So this from the striatum is no longer happening. So D2 will downregulate the GABA coming from the striatum. So now GPE is upregulated. So now GPE is upregulated. And then now we can release GABA here. Now what happens when the GPE releases GABA to the subthalamic nucleus? Well, the subthalamic nucleus can no longer release glutamate. Okay, well we just said glutamate's excitatory, but it's exciting the globus pallidus internus. So now the globus pallidus internus is no longer releasing GABA. And if the globus pallidus internus is no longer releasing GABA, then the thalamus can go ahead and initiate movement. I know this can get confusing, so I'm going to go over it one more time. So in summary, in the direct pathway, normally what's happening is that the GPI is releasing GABA, so inhibiting the thalamus, so no motion. Once dopamine is introduced into the direct pathway, D1, it is upregulating the striatum. The striatum will therefore release GABA and inhibit the GPI. And if it's inhibiting the GPI, then we'll have motion. The indirect pathway, what's normally happening, is the same thing really. The subthalamic nucleus is activating the GPI. And by activating the GPI, it's allowing the GPI to release GABA and stop the thalamus from initiating movement. In the background, the striatum is consistently releasing GABA to block the globus pallidus externis. But when D2 is introduced, D2 will inhibit the striatum, thereby inhibiting its ability to block GPE. So the net action is the activation of the GPE. The activation of the GPE is to block the subthalamic nucleus, which is activating the globus pallidus internis, which will release GABA. But now it cannot release GABA and will have motion. The best thing to do in understanding this pathway is to draw it a couple of times for yourself. Follow this video a few times and I think you should get it. Good luck.